Hello, this is Phil Rooney. We are here at the Minnesota Makọce informational webinar. We are very excited to be here with you today. We're going to be going over some things regarding the Minnesota Makọce curriculum, and we are going to be hosted by the trainee of the curriculum and one of the co-creators. Today, we're going to be going through a few particular steps here, and we're going to go over the curriculum overview. We're going to go over why this curriculum is necessary, kind of what the context is around the curriculum. We're going to be going over the teacher training and how the teacher training will function, and the logistics regarding the teacher training. And then we're going to be going over any questions that you may have. So on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a chat box. And at any point during this session, you can enter in questions on the chat box. And then we may be answering them as we go. But we'll also have time at the end of the session to be able to answer that as well. All right, sorry, there we go. Hey, now we're up. That looks right. All right, so that's what we're going through today. So a little bit of background. My name is Phil Rooney. I work with the University of Minnesota. I'm a MSW student here at the U, and I am a CREATE scholar. CREATE is an initiative of the Institute of Environment here and the Humphrey School. And we are joined by Darlene St Clair, who is a Dakota scholar and professor at St. Cloud State. You should have received a handful of documents via email this week. Those documents I will also be sending as a follow-up, and soon we will also have those up online on the Dakota Wicoḥan website. Just so you know, also, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting that online once we are able to do that. So later this fall, we will have that up and ready for you. So a few of today's goals, briefly. Our goal is to help build your understanding of this curriculum and this training. So that's a lot of what Darlene will be speaking to. We'll be helping to build your investment into the value of this curriculum. And I'll be helping you start thinking through a plan for what it would look like to implement this in your district. And in closing, we'll also begin to think about what some next steps are for you guys to be able to participate or host a training. So we'll be covering some of that as well this morning. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Darlene, because she is a brilliant scholar and is here to share with you some of her knowledge. So I'll turn it over to her.
Share your PowerPoint at the bottom. You can go ahead and say hi. Where? You're up there.
Okay.
We are just getting our PowerPoint set up.
All right. Hamitaku yapi. Ampetukinde chi iuskian wachiankapi. Washichu Darlene St Clair. Ie kiapiwi de miee. Washichu ikje wichasha wa unspe wichake hemacha St Cloud unspe wakantu et tawani. Petukinde iuskian wachiankapi. Ampetukinde yahipi kinwashte echichiapie. Hello, my relatives. Today I greet you with a good-hearted handshake. I'm Ie Kiapiwi. My Dakota name means recognized woman. It translates to recognized woman. My Washichu name is Darlene St Clair. And I'm a professor. I teach Native Studies at St. Cloud State University. I'm happy to see you all here today, or know that you're all out there, and I want to welcome you. So today we're going to be talking about a project that I've really invested a significant amount of time in the last probably 5 to 6 years. And I expect that this kind of work will continue to have a big impact in my life. So today we're talking about a curriculum project called Mni Sota Makọce, the Dakota Homelands curriculum. So I worked on developing this project with a Native nonprofit called Dakota Wicoḥan, and that phrase means Dakota Way of Life or Dakota Lifeways. And this is a regional nonprofit that is working across boundaries, both state boundaries and tribal boundaries, to connect Dakota communities, but also to do outreach into non-Dakota spaces to talk about Dakota experience. The focus of Dakota Wicoḥan is to revitalize Dakota language and lifeways, and we do that work in sort of 3 different ways and using Dakota sort of values. So one is Kiksuya, to remember. So that's the work that we do that is engaging in remembering our traditional ways, our language. Kiyuashte is to reclaim. And what we're reclaiming are our language, our lifeways, and of course our relationship to the land in Mni Sota Makọce. And Kichiwashte, to reconnect. We're also looking at contemporary Dakota people are reconnecting, and we're reconnecting to those kinds of relationships to ourselves, to our family, our extended family, our community, and that relationship to the land. And this is sort of the way that the work of Dakota Wicoḥan is organized. So this work, since the beginning, has been done in Native communities and through Native communities. So part of my work comes from being a teacher and thinking about the ways that I see Dakota experience and Native people in general kind of absent from the consciousness of most Americans and certainly most Minnesotans. There is sort of a general understanding of Native people and Native experience, but Native people are generally positioned in a past, and the story is sort of a generic story of colonialism, that a long time ago Native people lived here and then they're gone and it's unclear how they came to be gone, and now this is ours, and that's sort of a colonial narrative. Generally, I would say Minnesotans understand that there's some kind of tragic history, but there really isn't any access to sort of the specifics. And because of that limited understanding, and that's not, I'm really talking about the general public. It is easier to ignore, forget, minimize, or actually erase Dakota people and our experiences. So this curriculum is really developed to address that ongoing erasure. In addition, I'm sure many of you recognize that there are educational achievement issues in Minnesota. So one way of looking at that is the adjusted cohort graduation rate. I bet you know what that is. But just to sort of look at some of the statistics, 2010, 2011, when they first sort of started measuring in this way, Native students were graduating, 42% of Native students were graduating within 4 years. And these are in public schools. 42% Native students graduating, and if we can compare that, the same year, white students are graduating at a rate of 84%. So Native students are graduating at half the rate of white students in Minnesota. And then to continue looking at those statistics, we see we're the worst in the nation in 2010 and 2011. In 2012, 11-12, while it improved slightly, we're still the worst in the nation. It starts making some slight improvements, but if we were to look at the most recent data, we're at 51% of Native students graduating and 88% of white students graduating. So we recognize, I don't think there's any debate that there are educational achievement and disparities in Minnesota. So we think about that as context for this curriculum. We know that most Native students attend public schools. It's like 95% of Native students attend public schools. The efforts to increase the educational achievement in the past have focused on the deficits or the needs of Native students. So by that, I would say Native students are targeted. It's the Native students that need to change so that they can do better in educational institutions. And if we think historically, we look at the first mission schools in the United States, which actually were in the early 1500s, and that we have our entire history as a nation is that is really an assimilationist model, that Native students need to change so they can do better in educational institutions. Some of these programs that have focused on Native students have been positive. We see, especially in the 70s, increased tribal control over curriculum and funding when it comes to education, and that's been positive. In general, when I talk to and teach educators myself, I know that there's an increased recognition of privileges and disadvantages and how that plays out in schools, institutions, and communities, and recognizing that that has an impact on educational achievement. So I'd say within the past 5 to 10 years, I start seeing a recognition of that, and that's a positive. And many of these focuses, many of these arguments and the initiatives around this argument is focusing on socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, and school funding inequities. And all of these are reasonable concerns. However, I believe that underlying these efforts since the 1500s is an investment in an assimilationist model, that Native students have to change to do better. And not just Native students, but their families and their communities, that they have to change in order to be more successful in educational institutions. And that's the place where I diverge, and I want us to think in a different way. I would argue that is the positioning and the disconsciousness of non-natives that reinforces oppressive systems. And when I say disconsciousness, I want to just sort of explain what I mean by that. We understand that there's an unconscious and a subconscious, and there's things that we are aware of and not really aware of. The disconsciousness means that there's something that you have some knowledge of, but you choose not to be conscious of. It's sort of selective. And I believe it is this kind of this disconsciousness that leads to the sort of erasure of Dakota people. The ignorance of our Native experience, that ignorance, and that ignorance is fine, is tied to colonial systems and settler privilege. And what we see is that this contributes directly to the erasure of Indigenous people within that public consciousness, and I think that's really critical. We see that this has been inscribed in our curriculum and enacted in our pedagogy. And it is this positioning that I really challenge in this curriculum project. So the project is curriculum called Mni Sota Makọce, the Dakota Homelands. It is 10 lessons, and the lessons have been organized to sort of fit into 45 minutes. I will be honest and say we defer to the expertise of teachers. I would think that 45 minutes is sort of the bare minimum, and many of the teachers that have taught this curriculum already talk about the ways that they expand on this for greater impact. So 45 minutes would be the bare minimum. The goals of this project is to center Dakota experiences and voices, to assert that Mni Sota Makọce, the lands that we all live on, is a Dakota place, to portray the history of Minnesota or the history of Mni Sota Makọce as a shared history. It's not just the history of Dakota people, it is the experience by everyone who lives in Minnesota. However, that is not experienced in the same way. To address the invisibility experienced by many Native students, and that this curriculum would be taught throughout the Mni Sota Makọce region. So I've been working with teachers for many years, and I definitely recognize that teachers have an increased understanding that they need to recognize who's in their classrooms, and I think that that's really important. But I also want to point out that we need to be teaching about Indigenous peoples even if you don't have Native students in your classroom. That's part of our Minnesota heritage. And so whether you live near a Native community or you don't have many Native students, the responsibility of these systems is to teach about Native history. And so I want this curriculum to be taught throughout the region, not just in Native communities. The curriculum highlights community voices, and I think that's really critical. As I said, Dakota Wicoහැ, the nonprofit, we come out of Dakota communities. We use oral ways of knowing and learning. We elevate those. We use Wicho Oyake, or some of these traditional stories, these teachings, to sort of talk about Dakota relationship to land. Some of this is based on a prior oral history project that Dakota WicoÄan engaged in. We use storytelling as pedagogy, as something that a way to teach children, which has been ancient and traditional for Dakota people and very effective. We think about sense of belonging in this curriculum, and especially we're thinking about a sense of belonging that we would like to see students develop a belonging to the land. We encourage students to see themselves as part of this larger story. This is not the story of Native people and then they're disconnected from it. This is a story that we share, both Indigenous people and settler society. And I think what's most powerful about this curriculum is we provide a lens or a window for students to consider both historical and contemporary Native experience, particularly Dakota experience. And this is something that I think is really important, that this happens during 6th grade. 6th grade is when we learn Minnesota state history. So we interpret and we consider the history of Minnesota in a different way if you have an opportunity to sort of see that history through a Dakota worldview or that lens. This curriculum can be challenging for teachers, not because the concepts are that difficult, but that especially social studies teachers sort of have an idea of what a social studies lesson looks like. And in many respects, what's being taught, especially in the first half of the curriculum, is oriented towards philosophy. The first half of the curriculum, the first 5 lessons, is really focusing on traditional teachings, Dakota concepts and orientations. That would include worldview, traditional values, a concept that we engage in very deeply called Mitakuye Owasi, issues of relationality and thinking about the ways that we're related to one another and we're related to creation, the landscape, that the land is a relative. These are some traditional concepts that are engaged in the first half of the curriculum. And once you sort of have an understanding of these traditional teachings, we really start seeing our history as differently. That's my belief. These traditional teachings, this would not be widely accessible outside of Dakota communities. These teachings come from Dakota communities. So it isn't like you could easily just buy a book or get access to these teachings in some other way. It really does have to come through our communities. So, Mni Sota Makọce, which I referred to, Mni means water in Dakota. Sota means kind of like, it can mean different things, or it's translated differently. So it could be the clouds are reflected. It could mean cloudy. And Makoce means land. So when we say Mni Sota Makọce, we mean the land where the water reflects the clouds or the skies. And this is the region that we, Dakota people, this is what we've named this region. And of course, I want to just be clear, this does not mean the colonial outline of the state of Minnesota. Mni Sota Makọce as a concept has existed long before there was a state. So the curriculum, as I pointed out, is 10 lessons long. The first lesson is Mni Sota Makọce, or Homelands. And I want to point out that you all have been sent a curriculum outline. So this is going to be called Mni Sota Makọce, the Dakota Homeland Curriculum Outline. So this is something that you have in the packet that Phil sent you. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. So the first one is really about homeland. Then we delve into this concept of Mitakuye Owasi, means all my relatives or all my relations. The next is thinking about our relative, the land, how it is we see the land and everything on the land and in the air and in the water as being a relative. That's a traditional teaching. Then the next lesson is looking at traditional Dakota values, but not just thinking about what are the values, but asserting that values, we have our personal values in order to act upon them, to use them, guide decision making. And of course, this is a very, I think, appropriate thing for 6th graders to be engaging in, thinking about their own personal values and how they act on their values and how they use their values to guide decision making. So this is the 4th lesson. And the 5th lesson is about a concept called Ikche Wichashta. Ikche Wichashta in Dakota translates to common man, or could be generalized as common person. So Ikje Wicohan is a concept of thinking about how is it that we live into our humanity, our greatest humanity. And in order to live into our humanity, we have to be thinking about the ways that we have been dehumanized and the ways that we have dehumanized others. And we have to sort of address those things and think about that in order to reach our common humanity. So that's the 5th lesson, Ikje Wicohan. So those are the first 5 lessons, and they're very philosophical in nature. And now we're going to start applying these ideas, applying these teachings to sort of Minnesota history and experience. So the 6th lesson is talking about place names in Minnesota. And this is probably, of all the lessons, the one that is most familiar to social studies teachers, but I think we get at place names and we get at it in a much different and deeper way. Then we have a 2-part lesson that is looking at sort of colonization or the impacts of land loss, treaties, federal government policy. And once again, we're going to look at these, really in only 2 lessons, but we're really trying to look at that through a Dakota worldview. And that reads different, I think, to students once they've had access to that way of thinking. And then the second one is talking more about the events of 1862, but briefly, and thinking about how did Dakota people who have a relationship to the land as a relative, how did those experiences impact us? Then we're thinking about how does decolonizing or re-indigenizing, how is that happening today? So how are we reconnecting with land and language? How are we reconnecting with our traditional artistic practices? And what does that do for contemporary Dakota people to both decolonize, which is to sort of get a sense of how's colonization affected us, and what are the ways that we can address those issues? And then what many people call re-indigenizing or indigenizing, like how do we bring our traditional ways, our Wicohan, back into our lives and communities? And how might that positively impact the larger culture? And then the last lesson, the 10th lesson, is living together in Mni Sota Makọce. So students have had an opportunity to think about that, feeling like you're considering what it would be like to feel like you're a relative to the land. Now we're asking students to think about how might they continue to live and make decisions with that understanding in mind. So that is the 10 lessons. The features of the project, so sort of how it's organized, is that there is a required teacher training. I want to say that, well, I'm going to talk about that in a bit. There's a required teacher training in order to access the curriculum. We have developed a research project around this initiative. So for 3 years, we had cohorts of schools around the state be teaching the curriculum, and we did pre and post questionnaires and pre and post focus groups to sort of measure what kinds of impacts came to students. And we're in the process of finalizing some of our qualitative data, and we will be publishing on this in the next few years. But the reason to do a research project, which was significant in terms of labor and time and resources, is to really point out that this is a research-based project, that this is something that has been done with tremendous consideration and an evaluative aspect. The curriculum is a living document. We never think that this is going to be done. This is something that we intend to continue to review and to expand and to build on. And for that reason, it exists online. It is developed with varied teacher comfort and expertise in mind. So one of the things we learned from our research cohorts was that some teachers are entering this project with more expertise in terms of Native history and Native experience, and some teachers have almost none. And so we developed the curriculum in a way that there's those supports in the curriculum, embedded in the curriculum, so essentially like a script that could be read if a teacher really needed that extra help. But we also want to recognize that teachers have their own expertise. They know their classroom better. So there's a lot of flexibility in how the lessons are acted out. We have considered Minnesota state standards, and I'm sure you're aware that there are standards about teaching, both in social studies, but in most of the major subject areas, about teaching about Minnesota tribes and communities. And I often remind teachers that it isn't just the tribe or the nation that lives near you, but that no matter where you are in Minnesota, you need to teach both about Dakota and Ojibwe. And so that's so it is required that there's teaching about Minnesota tribes and communities, and this curriculum has been developed with those in mind. In addition, this is not developed to replace Northern Lights. We worked closely with the folks at Minnesota Historical Society as they've developed Northern Lights, and this is something that supports Northern Lights. So if your school uses Northern Lights, you should not think of this as something that now takes the place of it. Northern Lights does some things very well, and because it's much longer in terms of, you know, the textbook or the resources, it really extends for an entire year, and our lesson is much shorter. What we're trying to do in this curriculum is do what Northern Lights can't do, hasn't done, and really wouldn't be able to do, and that is develop something that is from Dakota communities with Dakota perspectives centered. Northern Lights would not have real capacity to do that. So we encourage the continued use of Northern Lights if that's what you use, and we have sort of tried to align the curriculum along with Northern Lights. So you also have received a document that is connecting it to standards, the state standards, and a document that has connected it to Northern Lights. So those are things that you've already received. So, well, the sort of positioning of this project is our belief that at the foundation of educational achievement and equities is the disconsciousness of settlers and settler-oriented institutions, which would be all Minnesota state institutions, all United States institutions. It is that disconsciousness that we're looking to sort of disrupt. We believe that initiatives that focus on assimilating Native students will continue to have the same impacts that it has had since the 1500s, which is that Native students just are really struggle to be successful. And so we're looking for shifts. We see that this is more of a system problem and not a student problem. We recognize that we need to educate to facilitate this shifting of paradigms. So I often say to teachers that I'm talking to, while I love you 40-year-olds, I have, as an educator, I'm investing my time and energy in sixth graders. I think sixth graders is the better investment. And so we recognize that in order to facilitate a shifting of paradigms that does not continue to erase Dakota experience, we're investing in sixth graders. This requires change beyond content. You can't just change content. Some of that is pedagogical, and some of that is kind of like relationship and commitment. It does require that we work on some strained relationships over time. And I think one of the most important things that I want to point out is that some of these pedagogies and some of these teachings have been very meaningful for students who are not Native. Many students find that some of these ways of thinking about the world make sense to them, and many sixth grade students really connect with some of these traditional teachings, and they can have a very significant impact on lots of students. So just to give a little bit of context, I want to just share sort of what some teachers have said. So one of the teachers that was in our research cohort said, I consider this curriculum an amazing opportunity, and I would highly recommend to anyone who teaches sixth grade Minnesota history. Students were extremely engaged throughout the curriculum. We had rich discussions, and students asked amazing questions. So that's from a teacher in our cohort. I want to show you, this is from an activity that a teacher developed in order to get at the concept of Wicohan. So we can see, if just to point out that this is, that thing in the middle of the image is a rock, which has a lot of positive things attached to it. And there's pickaxes that are sort of chipping away at it that have been labeled. But I'm gonna let the student explain this to you. And here's what they said. My picture depicts a rock being chipped away at, dehumanized, by 4 pickaxes. This represents human qualities being taken away by violence, greed, racism, etc. I think that this represents this quite accurately. I'm always happy to see this kind of confidence in our kids. And another perspective from a student who is in the research cohort. This project really reached out to me and made me feel more connected to Mni Sota Makọce. I also feel like I'm more connected to my culture and made me feel like I should value it more. I feel as if I'm also more united with the people around me, and I feel like I should respect others' beliefs and culture differences. So this is from a 6th grade student. So I mean, while these are the kinds of larger impacts that some classrooms have seen, and I think that this is really inspiring to me. So teacher training. I talked before, I said that the teacher training is required. And I know some folks might say, well, just give us the curriculum and we'll read through it and we'll do fine. Our experience is that that has not been the case. In our research cohort, when we had teachers without a lot of support to try to teach the curriculum, many of them felt that they did not have the capacity and were discouraged, and what we often saw was that they didn't fully teach the curriculum out of that discomfort. We know if we were to reflect on our own K-12 experiences, most of us have not been properly prepared with a sense of Native history of Minnesota, both Dakota and Ojibwe experiences to prepare us. We also, if we reflect on our teacher preparation programs, this is another place where there's a lot of growth that needs to be made in order to properly prepare our teachers. So I totally recognize that teachers generally don't feel, have a lot of confidence in teaching this content. We know that increasing teacher capacity and even their sense of confidence in teaching this material has a real impact on the impact of the curriculum. So for that reason, it is required that teachers take a training to implement the curriculum. So in addition, as I said, this is ongoing, both in terms of review, but we also would like to see the Mni Sota Makọce curriculum project as being kind of a community of educators that stay connected. We intend to develop additional resources that will be a benefit. So new features will come into play. We're making edits and improvements as we hear back from teachers about the places, the aspects that may have been difficult to teach, or maybe we need to dig a little deeper. We need to explain things in a different way. We're totally, this project is positioned to actually take feedback from teachers very seriously. We want to share what works. So we know that there are teachers who have implemented this curriculum that are doing some great things in their classrooms that they have developed. And we hope to add in an element of the website so that teachers can share, here's how I taught this lesson, here's how I expanded on this lesson, and I found it to be really successful. So this is the benefits of staying connected. So while certainly once you attend the curriculum, you would or attend the training, you would have access to the curriculum, we really encourage that districts, schools, and teachers stay connected with us as a community. So I think I'm going to hand it back over to Phil. So
Hello. Is it back on me? Yes, hey, okay, sorry, making sure the screens are right. So thank you, Darlene, for sharing your knowledge. We are excited to continue to learn with you, and hopefully this provides a valuable resource for districts and teachers to understand the curriculum. I'm briefly gonna go through just a few points regarding training logistics, how to schedule those, and a little bit of background information on those trainings. So we have a, let me make sure my slideshow is up. Yeah, hold on. It's always so exciting to work with the webinar thing. Excuse the moment. Here we go. Almost. Okay, training logistics, yay! Thank you all for your patience. Okay, so as Darlene noted, the training is required for access to the curriculum. Initially, the training was 13 hours long. That has been shortened by Darlene into 7 hours, which can be delivered in an all-day training or across 2 sessions, depending on what works for your district. We will be sharing with attendees a certificate of attendance, which can be used to support teachers getting those clock hours and those CEUs. Non-teachers can also attend the trainings. So I know that there are folks out there who don't work in education who may be interested in learning from Darlene in this kind of setting. And when there is an open registration for training, those non-teachers can attend. But also districts can send non-teachers. So that could be Indian education staff, that could be paraprofessionals or curriculum leaders. We understand that those folks play an integral role in supporting teachers in providing the curriculum and in supporting students. So we know how valuable that can be. We do have the pricing schedule listed on there that Darlene and Dakota Wicoḥan have developed over time. So it is designed so that the more educators who are at the training, the more cost-effective it is to provide the training. And that's just to respect Darlene's time and Dakota Wicoḥan's time. So you can see that for 5 to 9 educators, it is $450 per person. For 10 to 19 educators, it is $350 per person. And for 20 to 30 educators, it is $200 per person. And for any open trainings, that would be cut across, spread across all the districts who are participating. So if we have an open training and a district sends 3 teachers, but there are 15 teachers there, then they would be paying the $350 per person rate and not the $450 per person rate. So again, that helps build an opportunity to collaborate across districts to be able to host a training. So we can do district-specific trainings, and we do recommend those if there's more than 10 teachers to be trained within a district. We can do regional trainings. We are in conversations right now to do an open training in the metro area and in central Minnesota. And if you're interested in ensuring that there's a training in your region, you can be in conversation with us and with Darlene to set that up. Right now, any questions regarding training can be shared with the support staff here. That's with myself. This webinar is being recorded, and the future questions regarding training scheduling can be sent directly to Darlene, and her email will be at the end of this training, so you can have access to that if you don't already. So just a few notes for as you're thinking about next steps for your training. There are a few things that we do want to get all set up. I do have a Google form that will be set up that just asks some basic questions regarding your district, whether you're looking to share a training or have your own training, about how many staff you have in mind, and what the process is for your district to get support for the training. We understand that with the cost, that it is an investment for your district in the curriculum, and that it is a worthwhile investment for your staff time and for your district. So that does require some approval on your end and a contract in place and all of that. So once you have the approval to move forward, you can be in touch with Darlene or myself to schedule regional or district-specific training. Once we have a location and date and all the number of staff to be set up, we can figure out completing the contract and getting that to Darlene. And then it's just kind of your job to make sure your staff can make it there. Whether the training is held on a non-school day or on a school day, you need to, of course, make sure that all your staff are covered and your classrooms are covered, of course. That's your job, not mine. Okay, so I flew through some of the questions regarding some of these training logistics. I understand you may have more questions about that, and you may have more questions for Darlene. So I want to set up some space here for there to be kind of a broader conversation and any questions that you may have. So we can go into any questions. So if you have any questions, you can type that into that chat panel on the right, and I'll be sending those over to Darlene. So Darlene, we have a question here that is regarding how do you support teachers who adopt the curriculum?
That's a good question. So we, it could be different ways. One is we'd like to sort of develop a community. So it might be that some of that support comes from other folks who are teaching the curriculum or have taught the curriculum. But I would be available if there is some, if maybe it's a phone call or a conference call, maybe it's a visit. I mean, I could make myself available to support teachers. I do recommend, if you have Indian education staff, my experience has been that they are they can really be a tremendous support to teachers, especially because there is Dakota language in the curriculum. We do have some resources that are online and additional resources that are coming that teachers would have access to. In my experience, the Dakota language aspect of the curriculum is really received very enthusiastically by students, and often received with fear and trepidation by adults. There's definitely support for Dakota language, and also your Indian Ed staff. If you have that, I really recommend reaching out to them and including them in the training and figuring out ways that you can do sort of extensions within your classroom or potentially for Native students if you think that's important.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here from Ellen regarding the timeline for the metro area training. Right now, it is our timeline to be hosting a metro area training. We have some tentative dates in mind for late September. We have to confirm those dates with our potential host. So it is our goal to be able to schedule an open metro training between September and November. So I know that's a pretty big window. Right now, we're looking at the last week of September. So working on scheduling that very soon. Our timeline for a central Minnesota training this fall is in early November. We do have to try to limit the trainings right now just based on Darlene's capacity. She is teaching at St. Cloud State. So we are setting up trainings about 1 or 2 a month this fall. We have recognized that once the winter's passed, it doesn't really make sense to host trainings in the spring because it doesn't give your staff enough time to implement the training. So that is somewhat limited for this school year, but next year there will also be opportunities to participate and host a training. So even if in the fall of 2019 your district is not able to attend or participate in a training, we can set that up in the future. This is a long-term curriculum project that, as Darlene noted, is a living document and continues to be updated, and there will be future opportunities to participate in trainings and get on board.
I just want to say, I encourage you, if you want to get involved, I encourage you to reach out and reach out to Phil or myself, because if we know you're interested in being involved, then we can loop you in as decisions are being made. So rather than waiting for that metro area training to be scheduled, why don't you just connect with us, and we'll make sure that as we're making decisions about date and place and time, that we'll be able to include you, and hopefully it'll be easier for you to schedule. And then even if I so want districts to adopt this, and I want to support teachers as they teach us ongoing. So with any kinds of question, I encourage you to reach out, and we'll do our very best to accommodate your needs.
Yes. Thank you, Darlene. That's excellent. I do have a question here regarding the 10 lessons. Do those have to be taught within like a 10 class period, like in a 2-week period, or once per week, or once every other, or once a month? How does it work best to spread those lessons out?
So what we've had teachers do is all different. I think what teachers typically do is they look at sort of their plan for the year, and some teachers have taught it in a 2-week time period, and that's just the way they preferred, and that's the way they thought about it. But other teachers have really stretched it out over a semester, over a quarter, some over a year. And they wove in lessons in a way that made sense to them. So it is not required that you teach it day after in 10 slots. However, we do think it should be taught in the order that it's organized in, and what we're more concerned about is that teachers skip lessons oftentimes because of maybe some discomfort in teaching it. So if you have teachers who are feeling like, oh, this is going to be difficult, that's when you reach out to me or Indian Ed staff, and we'll try to provide that support. And that means team teaching a lesson, or pulling someone else in to guest teach a lesson, so that then that teacher can sort of observe and get some experience. So all of those options are available. But yeah, it does not have to be over 2 weeks. In fact, I would probably encourage it to be, I think it makes more sense for teachers to weave it into their plans that they already have.
Great, thank you, Darlene. And it does sound like for it to be most effective, teachers should teach all 10 lessons in order. They should not just pick and choose the parts that they're comfortable with, even though knowing that with the teacher's knowledge of their classrooms, how exactly those lessons are implemented may shift a little bit. We have another question here regarding being able to join another training within a region. Again, as Darlene noted, I think if you are able to contact us, we can let you know what trainings are coming up, and then we can make sure that we can loop you into a training in your area. If you have other people within your organization or other folks that you think would benefit from this type of knowledge base, you can organize several folks to co-host or to participate together in the training. But I think that starting point will be contacting us. And we, as it's noted, this curriculum really is built primarily for teachers, but there is a lot in here that is of value for folks who are not themselves teachers in schools, whether that be for naturalist educators or youth development professionals, or folks working in other settings. There may be some value in here and ways to implement some of this work, but it is designed for 6th grade social studies in Minnesota. So, okay, are there, I'm not sure if we have any other questions at this time. If you have more questions or are watching this recorded and have questions, you can submit those to Darlene. Her email is on this slide here. It is dk.stclair@stcloudstate.edu. We can also send you more of the documents, and this fall we will be uploading this video and all of the documents like the curriculum alignment with the state standards. We will have all of that up on the Dakota Wicoḥan website. And as a follow-up, I'll be sending all the participants today a Google form for to give us some feedback on the effectiveness of this webinar, but also the Google form to figure out what your next steps will be. And for those of you who are watching a recorded session, that Google form will also be accessible via the Dakota Wicoḥan website. I think that's everything that we have to cover at this time, unless there's any last minute questions. And I do want to be able to, hey, we're finishing 10 minutes early, which is fantastic for all of you folks out there who have a busy day ahead of you. Thank you so much for participating in this. And Darlene, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. We have so much to learn with you and from you, and we are so thankful for your investment.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone who attended the webinar and all the folks who are going to view this webinar in the future. I hope to see you or representatives from your schools and districts at an upcoming training, and I look forward to developing relationships with you all throughout the state to make this kind of important shift. So I really want to say, Wopi to Tonka Echichi Apie. I'm very very grateful to you all, and I hope to see you soon.
Great. Thank you.